All right, recording. All right, as you know, the meeting will be recorded and it's going to be on the Rpsv website, and I'll send a link to Malcolm to put onto the Bsap meeting or website. All right, so our presenters today, we're going to have five. We've got five presenters. Sue Burnell's presenting Smithy. Andrew Mortlock will doing the New South Wales 1891 Provisionals with a few new things. Gary Diffen will have his first time out Underpaid and Deficient Postage hand stamps of New South Wales. Martin Walker will have the 1920 Rpsv Vignette, and Roger Elliott will be presenting King George V Coronation cards. So we'll keep in this order. So Sue, if you're ready, you can start sharing your screen, and I'll stop sharing mine. You ready, Sue?
Yeah, I'm just doing it.
Okay, sorry.
There we go. Start. Right, can everybody see it now?
Yep.
Fab, thank you. Right, what I decided to show today is the end of Smithy's flying life, effectively, which is him and the aircraft which he named the Lady Southern Cross, which is pictured on the front page. And how did he fund the purchase of the aircraft? So his most famous aircraft was the Southern Cross, which he did his record-breaking flights sort of 1927 to the early 1930s, but it was a wooden fabric aircraft. So whilst he could use it to fly across the Tasman, and he used it for a series of display sites in New Zealand, he really needed to find something a bit more competitive, an all metal, which became an all metal aircraft effectively. So this is just a few slides showing his display. You can get quite a few tickets, as I'm sure people have seen over the years in various auction catalogues, but what they don't really go into the detail of is, unless it's written on them, where they were flown and what they related to. And to be honest, I don't know. But what's nice about this display catalogue, if you look at the bottom, is you can see the sort of prices he was charging people and what type of joyrides he effectively offered them. And another way of funding it, again, was to do personal appearances. You could clear about £300 to £400 a day doing this. So it was a very lucrative way of earning money at a relatively short period, although very tiring on him as an individual. And this is quite nice. His brother, who signed the photo in the middle of this page, was the organizer of the flights, and he went on ahead to set them up. And as you can see, Smithy signed it in January 33 at while he was in Auckland. He returned via 90 Mile Beach, and the reason they did that was the amount of fuel they had to carry meant that they needed a very long takeoff. So they're just some examples of covers that were carried on that flight. And his initial use of the money that he raised was to purchase a different aircraft, the Miss Southern Cross, and set up his Kingsford Smith Air Service Limited. In that era, a lot of aviators created a lot of limited companies with different purposes. And this was really sort of his aim as he was striking out on his own after his business partnership with Ormond ended, to try and make money by various ventures. And one aim was to try and get in on the Imperial Airways contract for the intended service, which eventuated at the end of the following year. Another thing which came up at the end of towards the end of 1934 in October was the Melbourne Centennial, or the Mac Robertson Air Race. And in order to do that, he needed a very competitive record-breaking aircraft. Mac Robertson wanted him to have the de Havilland aircraft, which eventually won, but he procrastinated and they were no longer available to him. So he went out to America and purchased this aircraft, which he originally called the Anzac, that led to a lot of protests and led to him changing the name to the Lady Southern Cross. And the first paragraph of what I've typed there is terms from the air race, which tried to maximise the safety of the participants as much as possible. And one of his issues was the lack of certification, because in order to be competitive, he needed to carry extra fuel tanks, which took it over its certificate of airworthiness. And this was one of the problems that contributed him to being forced to withdraw from the race itself. And this letter is the reason I decided to prepare this display. I was very lucky to acquire it recently with the radiogram. And if you see at the bottom, it's signed Smithy. I've only got 2 things now that were signed by him and his nickname. Normally he signed it with his full signature. And I've highlighted the arrow, his comments to Doc Maidment about being forced to compromise on the purchase of the aircraft. And I don't think, given the choice, he would have gone for it purely because of the inability to get a correct certification. And Doc Maidment is quite an interesting person. He was the go-to engineer for Wright brothers, who produced the engines for the Southern Cross, but he also took part in preparing the Spirit of St. Louis for Limburg and went on his farewell tour with it. And the radiogram to him was from Admiral Byrd, because he took part in one of his expeditions, and this was a request basically saying, we'll wait for you if you'll come and do the next one, which I don't think he actually did. So it's, you know, it's quite an interesting letter, and kind of gives a bit of a background to him as an individual. And one of the other problems he had was Turkey. With his previous record-breaking flights, Turkey was a military junta, and he'd overflown banned areas, which led them to ban him from the country. And the officials for the Mac Robertson were in delicate negotiations to try and get permission for him to be allowed to overfly Turkey again. And as part of their preparation, he and his co-pilot, Gordon Taylor, did a series of record-breaking flights within Australia. But unfortunately, as you can see from the photo on the bottom right, the cowling broke on the Lady Southern Cross, and that was partly due to the amount of fuel that it was expected to carry to be competitive in the air race. And that forced his withdrawal, and accusations of cowardice resulted. So he had to think of something else that he could do in a record-breaking way. And that was to fly back across the Pacific, which he'd first crossed in the Southern Cross in 1928. So you can see here, him and Gordon Taylor, a successful flight, as you can see from the advert that I put on the right, which is a nice colourful map of their route. And there's a couple of covers. The top one was carried from Hawaii into America. I do have a sort of big cover, and it's quite huge, but it's too big for my scanner, unfortunately, for me to show you. And that's another sort of commercial cover that was sent to him while he was at Oakland. And I think by now his health was failing and he was quite depressed, so he wasn't really fit to fly, and all in this point killed trying to fly across the Pacific, which again didn't help his mental health. So he went back to Australia, did the Tasman flight in the Southern Cross, which didn't end well. As you can see there, the propeller broke in the top right-hand corner and forced their return. I'm just going to zip through a few of these slides, but that just led to him having to withdraw the Southern Cross from active service, and that was supposed to be its final flight. You can see him there with Orm's son, and the final flight across Sydney. And that's just a scan from he went to America because he was trying to get a Tasman service off the ground, and he wanted to try and raise sponsorship for that. That failed. So he decided that he would then do one more record-breaking flight from England to Australia. And again, another failure was the Australian-produced Kodak aircraft that he'd sunk a lot of his money into. So hence he needed more money as well. And There you are, his final flight with the Lady Southern Cross. Again, he had a few more problems with the cowling, as you can see there. He took off, was forced to return. And that's photos of him taking off for the second time to attempt the record. And he was lost over the sea. No, he and his engineer in the plane were never really found, apart from, I think, a wheel arch many years later. Gordon Taylor was sent on a search, but was too ill to continue. That's quite affecting. That was John Stanage, who was his operations manager, writing to his Tommy Petherbridge's mother, saying, we've had to give up thoughts of the search and they're lost, and is there anything I can do to help you? And finally, just really, it's the end of an era. He was, to me, the epitome of a pioneering airman, and not one who would have sat comfortably with what commercial aviation was developing into, which is a more commercial, regular service. And that was it. That's my final slide. I hope you found it interesting.
Oh, thank you, Sue. I think we all found it interesting. It's the first time I've seen signature of Smithy. I've never seen the Smithy signature.
No, I was really fortunate, as Patrick will tell you. There was these 3 lots in Coronation, one of which was this album with a lot of ephemera. And I was the underbidder. There were 2 people overbid me. And it was 3 weeks later that Coronation sent out an auction, an invoice that said you've been successful. So 2 other people obviously failed to pay, but it could take, for whatever reason. I'd be fascinated. I've never known that. I actually watched the auction, well, we both did, online, and there were 2 different bidders, one in the room and one online, and they both outbid me on the lots. But I was delighted because that letter came through, which kind of led me to put this Zoom together around it. And a second letter he'd signed Smithy to, obviously, what must have been family friends, who'd offered condolences when his father died. Yeah,
no, that's excellent. Now, I've got no questions in the chat. So anyone out there got any questions for Sue?
Well also stunned.
No.
But it does kind of lead into what Martin's doing, because
that's right. Yeah, it does.
Again, was supposed to participate in the 1919 flight and got pushed out because of his behaviour. So unfortunately, became a bit of the story of his life, really.
Yeah. All right, Sue, can you stop sharing your screen? Yeah. And we'll get Andrew Mortlock to start sharing his screen.
Okay. We're going to have to leave now as well. So thank you very much.
No,
and sorry I can't stay for anybody else.
No worries. Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. It was really great.
We are. You can hear me now.
Yes. If you just go slideshow and then from the beginning.
Yep. Hang on a second. Okay, and somewhere, hang on a second. If I go to pointers on. And as Monty Python said, now for something completely different. So this is much more philatelic, and this is a sort of backwater of New South Wales philately that I rather like, and it really links to 3 stamps issued in 1891, issued really as a direct, should be UPU in the title, as a direct result of New South Wales joining the UPU. And it's kind of interesting in as much as, New South Wales was the only state that ever issued 7p halfpenny and 12p halfpenny stamps, and indeed Australia didn't get round to issuing them until the late early 1950s actually. So they're really rather odd beasts. To start off, the background for the stamps is that they use the plates that have been made by De La Rue for the sort of side face surface printed stamps in New South Wales, and I think Gary Diffen and I are the only people in the world who find these stamps interesting, because both of us rather like them. And this just shows you the basic stamps. So the penny, which is in red, tuppenny blue, fourpenny, which was in brown colour, sixpenny in purple colour, tenpenny again in a sort of violet colour, and shilling in black. And again, just to sort of one slide to sort of introduce the series. I guess in 1888, all of these got withdrawn apart from the tenpenny, because they were all replaced by stamps in the 100 Years series. The one that was missing is the ninepenny, and the ninepenny really set the precedent for sort of using an old plate to produce new values, because 1871, need for a new 9p stamp. New South Wales Post Office used the 10p plate, but rather than printing in purple, they printed in this rather nice sort of chestnut brown colour. And again, you can see on this, just a sort of background, again, you can see, used and mint blocks is the famous missing surcharge and double surcharge stamps at the bottom. And what's probably the nicest item, which is this double weight cover from 1872 with a pair of 9p used on cover, which again, relatively scarce usage. So the first of the overprints, which I'll go into, was the halfpenny. This was printed in much larger numbers than the others. There's 600,000 of these printed. And again, the penny was in red, so this is printed in grey. This stamp would only last for a year before it was replaced by a sort of proper, I can use that expression, halfpenny, using the same design. And again, sheets of this are relatively common. So this is the upper pair of panes from a sheet of, or from a plate printing rather, of 240. The sheets were always cut into two before being distributed to post offices. But you can tell this is from the upper plate because the monograms are in the top margin here. And obviously I could show you the other one, which again is just got the monograms in the bottom and the words on the top. Now this plate was in an absolutely terrible condition. And again, you can see there's a sort of series of very obvious sort of flaws, which are, I suspect, the result of the sort of nickel coating sort of peeling off. So again, you can see sort of a lot of surface damage on most of the stamps. This is one of the more dramatic ones on position 7 in the upper right plate. And again, you can see it wasn't unique to this printing. So again, I can show you here. This is a penny, whether OS or not. You can see it's exactly the same flaw. So the plate was clearly well used and damaged before 1888. It's not that it had sort of deteriorated further in storage. It was badly worn. You can see other platable flaws here, which again appear in the surcharge, and they also are present in the original plate. Again, I don't think there's surface damage. I think that's a nickel coat peeling off, and you see some of the same things in some of the Queensland stamps in the same period. Now, finding a stamp used on cover is more tricky. I suspect the New South Wales Post Office weren't totally happy with this character, who decided that rather than use a 6p stamp, he'd use 12 of their brand new halfpennies. Again, I think this is commercially used, it's used in the right period. Again, it uses one of the overprinted registration envelopes. So again, the registration rate was reduced from 4p to 3p in October 1891. And again, just showing you a picture from the back, this is one of the examples which was overprinted with the straight line 3p. So again, I think that's a commercial usage. This isn't. This is a character, and there are others of these out there. So this is actually a halfpenny pre-printed envelope, and this character is put on a newspaper wrapper. He's put on the halfpenny stamp. He's put on the provisional newspaper wrapper. And then there's the original stamp as well. So there's all 5. He sent it to New Zealand, and then guess what? It's come back to him, because the address wasn't known. So he spent 2p and he got a nice item for his collection. And there are others of these out there with the same sort of characters, but Parry is I think quite a well-known contemporary collector who generated these sorts of things. It's quite pretty, but it's clearly philatelic. Now, in terms of the other stamps that were needed, the 2p halfpenny became the foreign letter rate, and rather than use a provisional, New South Wales produced a new stamp at the end of 1890, so around about 9 months before the rate changed. Again, just including this to sort of show you why we don't have provisionals for that issue. And again, here's a rather nice monogram block from one of the printings, again showing the typical 3 monograms in the lower margin of New South Wales plates at that point. And this, again, a sort of triple weight unregistered letter to London. So again, in the UPU period, I guess I put it in there because it shows why they perceived there was a need for a 7p halfpenny stamp, because otherwise you were using 3 of these. For 5p, there was really no need for a new stamp because the diadem head stamp, first introduced in the mid-1850s, was still available, still a recessed printed stamp. This is just rather sort of standard example of a 5p used to pay a double weight registered letter to Germany. And again, you see the registration is paid by the envelope. So if we move to the 7p halfpenny, there are around 6 different types of perforation used on this stamp, and yet there's only a single printing. So I think this provides an interesting insight into the way New South Wales Post Office worked. I mean, they clearly printed all the 1,000 sheets of this stamp up front, but they were clearly left imperforate, and probably even left ungummed. So you can see the 6 different perforation types over the left-hand side here. There are 2 different types of specimen. You can see either in capitals or in lowercase letter. I personally find the capital one is much more difficult. And I don't have a big used block of this, I have to say. So best I can show you is a piece from an envelope which has got 4 of them used together to, again, pay I guess whatever that is. That's 2 shillings and 9p rate. Much nicer if it stayed as a used block, but unfortunately it isn't. Here's an example used on a registered envelope. So very nice single franking to Germany, again registered registration fee paid using the envelope. Again, sort of this is exactly what the stamp was designed for. Second used example, so this is the United States, and this is paying a double weight registered envelope. So again, halfpenny has been added to make 8p. So again, 5p postage and 3p registration on that. And the third example I can show on cover is this rather nice, probably the nicest of the 3 really. So this is a registered envelope to Italy. So it's paid at 7 times the tuppenny halfpenny rate. So you've got the 10p paying, put my cursor on it, 10p paying 4 times, 7p halfpenny paying 3 times, and the diadem head 3p is paying the registration fee. So Italy in 1899. So again, I think it's rather a nice cover. And again, none of the covers, I think, with the higher overprints are particularly common. For the 10p, so 4 times the rate. Again, no real need to have that because I've shown you that the 10p was available and continued to be printed from the De La Rue plate. This is an example from 1897. I think it's actually the earlier type of paper, not the sort of reissue in 1897. Again, rather a nice destination. So a registered letter going to Brazil, to Sao Paulo. Again, 4 times weight, so 10p stamp doing exactly what it was supposed to do. And again, some details there about how the stamp, how the letter got to Brazil. For the 12p halfpenny, again, very similar to the 7p halfpenny, there are 5 or 6 different types of perforation, again indicating that the stamp was, whilst it was a single printing, they perforated batches as and when you needed them. And again, as with the 7p halfpenny, you can see the 2 different types of specimen overprint. Again, the rarer one in capitals. Again, I haven't got large used blocks. The best I can show you are strips of 3 in different perforations. And again, the colours are slightly different, but it was a single printing. Now, when the stamp was withdrawn in 1902, it did seem that some of these got sold off. So this is actually a block of 30. I think I've also seen a full plane of 60, which was in an auction a while ago. So again, you can see the De La Rue plate numbers and the control numbers at the top one. So this is a vertical strip of 10, but as I've just shown you the top and the bottom just to make it visible. In terms of covers, this is probably the nicest one, certainly the first one I got. So this is an unregistered letter at 8 times the foreign letter rate. So you could argue they could have used a pair of 10p, or they could have used a shilling and an 8p. But fortunately for me, they used a 7p halfpenny and a 12p halfpenny to make up the 1 and 8 rate. Again, trimmed down on the left-hand side, but sent to a sort of well-known firm in Belgium, and you see other covers to this destination. But again, it's the only one I've seen with the 7p halfpenny and the 12p halfpenny on the same cover. This is, oh my word, that's not good, is it? Why has it done that? Whoops, you can't see the. Let me just. There you are. Can you see that? Or let me just get rid of that.
Yep.
Okay, let me just get up. So this is the example of the single franking. So again, relatively late. So 1902, the stamp was sort of withdrawn towards the end of 1902, I think it was. So single usage. To Newfoundland. Rate's a little odd because it's a registered letter. So when you first look at it, you think it's paying 5 times the rate, which is quite a lot for a small envelope. I suspect it's underpaid by a halfpenny. because if it was 4 times, it should have been a shilling and a penny. Again, sent to an interesting destination, a relatively small town in the coast of Newfoundland. So rather nice sort of single franking. Let me go back to screenshots. I don't know quite what was okay, showing nice properly now. And then the last example I've got a little battered, but it's the only one I've ever seen with a pair on. So again, you can see the stamps have suffered a little bit. It was a relatively cheap purchase, but again, a 1900 cover. So sent to Denver. It is charged at what have we got? We've got 2 shillings, 1.5, so 25.5 pence. So it's effectively a 9 times foreign letter rate plus certainly for registration. And again, travelled through Seattle and to Denver. But again, the only example I've seen, others may have seen them with a multiple on. Couple just final 2 slides just to pay a nod to the official stamps. I mean, the usage of the 7penny halfpenny and the 12penny halfpenny was really very limited. So they did produce officials, which were obviously lasted until the end of 1894. I've got to say the majority of the ones you see tend to be cancelled to order, as indeed the 12penny halfpenny here is. I think commercially used 7penny halfpennies and 12penny halfpennies are scarcer, and certainly the stamp is much more common mint. I quite like the sense that if you look at the specimen here, this has been overprinted 3 times in 3 different ways. So clearly the 12pence halfpenny was banged on, then somebody's put the OS on, and finally somebody's come along and put specimen over the top. So I'm not sure how many other stamps were overprinted 3 times, but certainly these were. Again, you used blocks and used multiples, forget it, apart from this one, which is a new acquisition. So I think this is cancelled by favour, in 1894, but it is still within the period where the stamps were used. It's kind of a remarkable block of 15 of the 7penny halfpenny. And again, this is a rare stamp or a very scarce stamp, used. This, I don't know whether this was used. I suspect it's cancelled per favour, or it's cancelled as a way of paying for bulk postage. But it's a very nice item to sort of finish up on. And hopefully, I've shown you that a couple of rather unusual stamps. If you hunt down the covers and things, you can make an interesting story. But certainly the covers are fairly scarce. And if you have any that you come across as a spare, please let me know.
Thank you, Andrew. Anyone got any questions for Andrew? Because I've got nothing in the chat. Geez, you must have done a good job, Andrew. I particularly like the usages. I think those that 9 times, 7 times, 12 times the rate. I reckon is fantastic. You hardly ever see that around. I don't think I've seen any of those covers. I collect Victoria. I don't collect New South Wales, but
yeah. No, I think any of the higher values used for any of the states colonies are tough, but
all right. Thank you, Andrew. Gary Diffen, you're up next. You're right.
I'm just about. Sorry.
You're right to go, Gary.
Yeah, I've just got to find it.
Well, share your screen and then find it.
Has that
there you
come
go.
up?
Yeah, it's up.
Beautiful. Now I need to do
slideshow from beginning.
Yep. There you go.
That's it.
Well, thank you and welcome everyone. Many people don't know that I actually collect instructional markings from all the Australian colonies, and this was actually a very popular field of collecting. There's a lot of postal historians through the 60s, 70s, and probably the early 80s. And it was very popular, and sadly, it's fallen away. But what it does do, it provides opportunities for students to discover new items, since the current literature on the subject is fairly old. It's from 1980s or earlier. The only one that's of any note that's any good is Patrick Reed's Tasmania, but all the rest of it is fairly old. And for South Australia, it doesn't exist whatsoever. So this is the first time I've shown anything from this collection. I've probably got, I don't know how many frames, But if you look at deficient and underpaid markings of the Australian colonies, you know, COVID provided a great opportunity for me to put an 8-framed exhibit together just of these of the Australian colonies. So what we're going to do is just have a bit of a look at New South Wales. I'm not going to show everything. I've broken it down into 6 major subject matters. The first is the insufficiently paid hand stamps, and these are the first ones that were introduced into New South Wales. The second one is the Anglo-French currency hand stamps, and I'll explain those a bit later when we reach those pages. We have deficient postage hand stamps, more to pay, which you see a lot more from Victoria than you do from New South Wales. And the last 2, 5 and 6 are nearly all of that is from the introduction of New South Wales into the UPU. So let's get into the first one. Sorry, I'll take you through a bit of a background. If you look at what instructional hand stamps were, it's basically a history of business process of the New South Wales postal system. If you put it into a context of what you would do now, what this represents is key dates of processing underpaid mail and how it was able to operate the postal service more quickly for underpaid mail. So these are some key dates, and I'll just quickly dwell on these. 1825 is the proclamation specifying charges for our outward and incoming letters that were not forwarded. By the time it got to 1834, there were so many unpaid letters at the GPO that they were listing published names of letters to be destroyed within 3 months. And so 1845, I had more details regarding the dead letters that were published. And 1850, what they did is that they stopped forwarding mail if it was only partly paid with postage stamps. There's a bit of conditions that sat around that, and I'm not going to go into that into detail. 1853 was the first, and I call them generic, insufficiently paid hand stamps. 1857, this was across for everybody. It was compulsory prepayment of postage internally as well as externally. And that had repercussions for how they sent the mail, as well as underpaid mail. And in 1871, it's the first specific value hand stamps. So this is the first insufficiently paid hand stamp. It's not a rare thing. You see a lot of these. There's a typo here. It was 1853, not 1855 to 1872. Had 2 similar types. They had a very long usage. And the one at the lower left is actually an 1853 usage. It's one of the earliest usages that I know of. And the cover on the right to France. And I don't know why, but it's insufficiently stamped in red. And if someone can point out why they did red or black, that I'd appreciate it, because I have no idea why they did this. If we go into making some comparisons, now, in New South Wales and Victoria, they tend to compare notes and throw rocks at each other. And the New South Welshmen call us Mexicans because we live across the river. But if you look at Victoria, they had a lot of insufficiently paid hand stamps. You know, for example, insufficiently paid via Marseille, insufficiently paid via Trieste, or insufficiently paid via the UK. There's a lot of hand stamps from Victoria. Very few. This is the only one that was from New South Wales, and it was an insufficiently stamped via Brindisi. And it's interesting to note that, you know, New South Wales used the insufficiently stamped rather than insufficiently paid. I've only seen this from 1870 to 73. It's a fairly scarce thing, and I've only seen about 10 of them, and most of them, these covers are in pretty ordinary condition. I'm going to go to the Anglo-French currency hand stamps, and I've actually been doing a bit of research on these things. And these hand stamps encompass not only New South Wales, but all the Australian colonies. What it is that it was a procedure of governing the exchange of mails between England and France. And this was made into, I was going to say law, but by the UK. And what the UK did is they sent to all the colonies in 1862, and that's all of the Australian colonies. And I suspect it went around the world, but especially Australian colonies, the instructional hand stamps they had to use for underpaid mail that was processed through France, or may have gone to Switzerland in this particular case, in this covered Germany. There were 3 instructionals and 3 Anglo-French hand stamps. So each colony received 6 hand stamps. The 3 instructionals, there was PP for partly paid, PD, paid for destination. You see these, especially the paid destination, PD, they're around on most of the colonies. They're rarer on some than others, especially, say, Western Australia. And the Anglo-French marks are the ones that you see in that diamond. I'm not sure, can you see my my mouse? Can people see? Yeah. So it's these particular hand stamps, and there was a change of rates. And so the UK government sent out 3 different Anglo-French hand stamps. And these were discontinued in 1876. The thing that's interesting about Victoria versus New South Wales is that from the Victoria, you see the 1862 hand stamps, but you don't see the 1866. And New South Wales is vice versa. I've never seen anything from the 1862 ones, but I have seen about 3 or 4 from 1866, of which this is one of them. There's more work that I need to do here, but a lot of these, especially from New South Wales, are fairly scarce. And if you go to other colonies, for example, I've never seen these used out of, say, Western Australia. I think there might be 1 or 2 out of Tasmania, and I've only seen 2 out of Queensland. So they're not the most common things because they're only used for underpaid mail. So let's look at the deficient postage hand stamps, and most people are familiar with these types of things. These came in between 1868 and 1894 for this specific one, which was fairly generic. It's deficient postage on one level, and underneath it's got the fine. And all these things all the amounts were introduced into manuscript. So it's fairly generic and covered many different deficient postage and fine and different postage rates. Then you get into I call them specific value hand stamps. This particular one was issued between 1868 and 1877, and I've got those particular dates in here. And this is outside of the White Book, who's probably the most read knowledge of these particular hand stamps. And so this was, a deficient postage of 6pence, so it should have been a 1 shilling letter. There's a fine of 6pence, so the addressee had to pay 1 shilling. And if you were the recipient of this letter, you say, why should I have to pay 1 shilling because the idiot over in New South Wales didn't provide the specific postage? So that was the reason to get probably the addressees annoyed, and to, when they wrote back, to be able to say, pay the correct postage. You're going to move on to the next ones. And these deficient postage hand stamps were a new set or in a new design. And this was to make the postal clerks who recognised that there was deficient postage in these envelopes, rather than writing them down or putting them in generic, they were specific hand stamps. They just grabbed that hand stamp and placed it on the mail. All of these new value were introduced from 1881. They're only used for a very short period of time. And all of these ones are either very scarce or very rare. And some of these ones that I'm going to show you here are the only ones I've seen. The one on the lower left with deficient postage of 8pence. So that's, if you look at the envelope there, it's underpaid by, it must be a 1 ounce letter instead of a ½ ounce. And there was a fine of 6pence. So there was a fine of 1 shilling 2pence for the recipient. Conversely, the one on the right, you can see that one. I've seen a couple of the one on the right. More of these came out, and the one on the left, deficient postage 4pence, fine 6pence. It's the only one I've seen. And the one with the tuppence halfpenny, and you can look at that, and it's just before the introduction. If you look at the date in August 1891, it was a couple of maybe a month or two before the introduction of UPU, and so I've only seen 2 of these. It's they're very scarce things. Some of the later deficient postage hand stamps, a bit more generic, and they're a bit more common. The one on the left is listed in white, and it's a generic one where it's got the postal official filled in the fine and the postage, and the fine in manuscript. The one on the right where it's deficient tuppence, fine tuppence. Although it's not listed in white, I've seen a couple of these. So they are very scarce, and it just proves that these things are available, they're around. It's just a matter of finding them. More to pay. And if you're a postal history buffon of Victoria, you'd be much more familiar with the more to pay hand stamps. And there's a lot more of these in Victoria than they're available in any of the other states. This is for the first one I've recorded is 1885, and it's actually that cover down below from Sweden to New South Wales. It's that 1 shilling 1 penny more to pay. There's a similar value hand stamp from Victoria available in this time period as well. I've only seen 2 of these. There must be more around. I've seen much more of these in Victoria, but they've only seen 2 of them into New South Wales. The cover up on the top right is a circular more to pay, and you get familiar with those. And there's a couple of different types of these. It's pretty battered, that cover at the right, but it's the only one I've seen. And the one that at the lower right in more to pay, it's a straight line hand stamp. And most people would be familiar with that because you see a lot of it on the Tats Mail. The figure of value hand stamps, and these were introduced from 1879, and it's very similar to the value hand stamps that were introduced into South Australia. They only had a couple of different values, and these used prior to the introduction into the UPU are very rare. So as you can see, the one at the lower left has the 6pence hand stamp, and then the one at the right has a 5pence hand stamp, and that was in use for quite a number of years. And the one at the base, that 2pence hand stamp, it's a different type of representation of the value, but you see those around. It's not particularly scarce. But you do see those around in that 2pence value. The second series of value was introduced in 1901, and you get to see a lot more of these, especially on postcards. I've picked out a couple of postcards here purely because the usage of the halfpenny value is really rare. As you can see, there's a ship letter onto the left, and they've actually blanked out the 1 penny late fee and used a halfpenny hand stamp instead, and it's got that onto the postcard. The one on the right is really interesting in that it's usage of 3 different hand stamps. The usage of the penny value, and they had in their locker room a serif that was sideways to represent another value. And then they put the halfpenny hand stamp next to it, because as you can see, that halfpenny hand stamp on the right is the same as the one on the left. So it was really interesting how they represented these, and these values went up to 10pence. But you do get to see a lot more of these in this federal period, and they were used in concurrent with some of the ones from Series 1, and they were used up to the 1912. The final one that I'm going to go through is the frame tax hand stamps in centimes. Now, these most people will be familiar with. You get to see a lot of these because they were introduced in 1901, purely because New South Wales, or the Australian colonies for that matter, joined the UPU. So it's represented in French centimes. for underpaid mail to foreign destinations. 10 centimes equals a penny. In 1906, the way that the shield hand stamps were represented changed. So if you look at the cover in the first one, it's a New South Wales T25, which means it's underpaid by tuppence halfpenny. If you look at the cover on the right, the cover on the left dated 1894, which is relatively early for these hand stamps. The cover on the right is dated after 1906, and it's got New South Wales T50. What that T50 represents is a deficient postage of tuppence halfpenny and a fine of tuppence halfpenny to make it a 5p represented in the centimes, which is 50 centimes. So that's how it was administered. So you can get the same type of deficient postage, but represented with two different hand stamps because it's used in two different periods. So that's an overall representation of these hand stamps from New South Wales. There's a lot more that fit within it, but this sort of fits within that framework and as an overall usage. And it's interesting to note that all the colonies had these, and they all use different types of representation. But it's an interesting period of Australian colonial philately, and I think that more people should take it up because I find there's very few of us around. Thank you, and any questions?
Thank you, Gary. Any questions?
I have a comment. I'll put this up to the screen here.
Oh yeah.
Hand stamps, brass hand stamps, all sorts. I'm actually helping curate a museum at the moment, so if you want any brass hand stamps, I have a few.
They're so hard to find, Martin. I mean, I've got a couple on my fireplace, Victorian ones, but I've never seen that many.
Yeah, I tended to take them all out of the second-hand market whenever I saw them, and they're boxed up. I've taken an impression of every one so people know what I've got.
Yeah.
Particularly after the Trevor Ely incident from a few years ago, where he was making his own covers. So
Well, that's an incident I'm not aware of, but you'll have to tell me about that one later, Martin.
Oh yes, he was forced to erase all the marks off his covers. So there are no fakes from that source. Yeah. Yes. So yeah, just a comment. They are around. Try the second-hand trade. The other point with the brass ones, of course, they all got withdrawn in the beginning of World War I to make shell cases.
Oh, really?
Oh,
Gary, Jack here. Can you elaborate about the postage due stamps, and which I know they started in 1891, but if a few of those covers you displayed had both the postage or short paid, and then it had the postage due stamps on them. So what was the sequence? Did the post office...
Well, if you look at the this one here,
Yeah.
This is coming from New Zealand. The reason that it got fined was because it's a loose ship letter, and it was underpaid. There's actually a halfpenny, what do you call it, postage due missing. So this was done first when it arrived in. They've assessed it as being underpaid, so these hand stamps were applied to it, and then the postage due was placed on the envelope when it got delivered to Miss Leake to say that the postage due had been paid by the person on arrival.
Right.
So the postage due is to make sure is the person who's actually paid for it. It's reached there and they've paid that postage due fine.
But the person then gets to keep the envelope, so it's sort of...
Correct.
Okay, and if you go back about 2 or 3 screens from where you are now, one of your exhibits had a Victorian postage due in the top right-hand corner, but didn't actually have any postage as such. I was just trying to work out how that came. I think it's one before that, maybe? No?
Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Yep.
So how would that have happened?
Yeah, it's Interesting one. It could be that this is a philatelic contrivance in
Right.
that that's a possibility. Certainly no postage stamps were on it whatsoever. And if you look at the postal regulations, if there was no postage stamps, if it was a penny and the postage was a tuppence, they'd let it go through and then they'd pay postage due at the end of it. If it was completely underpaid, less than 50%, generally they said, no, we're not sending it. And in this particular case, it should never have been sent whatsoever.
Right.
So this was sent from New South Wales because this is a New South Wales hand stamp. And this is a Victorian hand stamp. And that's where the postage due was paid.
Right. Interesting. Thanks, Gary.
Cool.
Okay, any more questions?
Yeah, Gary, is all of this applied in Sydney then? Is there anything that got applied outside Sydney?
Good question. I suspect all of it was in Melbourne. Oh, sorry, in Sydney, sorry. Yes.
Even the single line sort of later stuff, you think that's all in the
Sorry.
Sydney GPO?
Let me, if I go to see the more to pay down here, I would suspect every post office was issued with this one.
Yeah.
I think this more to pay is possibly a one that was the postmaster got made up by himself, got someone to make it up. This happened a bit in New South Wales, especially the registration hand stamps. I mean, I've got probably 30 pages of New South Wales registered covers, and the registered hand stamps are all different depending on which post office it was. So there was a bit of that going on, and that's what I suspect, you know, this top right cover is, this one here. But certainly I think every post office had this one.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So, Gary, what happened before 1891 when the postage dues were produced? How did they collect the more to pay?
Here, this way. Deficient postage, tuppence halfpenny. Fine was at tuppence halfpenny. The address.
Yeah, that's how they evaluated it, but they didn't have a postage due stamp to sell the recipient. How did they collect the money from the recipient, and what record of that transaction existed?
I don't know that particular level of detail. It's a good question. It's one of the things that I'm still trying to work out. You
get back to me on that.
It'd be interesting because I've tried to read up how they did that collection. You could actually it gets to the post office of, say, Poplar in England, and they go round to the Mr. Chamberlain and say, well, I've got a letter for you, but you need to come in and pay 5p.
But did they, without actually selling a stamp or a postage due stamp, their recording systems must have had some sort of like a receipt or something?
Yeah, they did have recording systems. And you look at registration, and they had recording systems for that. And in fact, it was really, what do you call it? It's really quite detailed for registered mail. I don't know how they did it here, because you need to sort of delve into the operations of the postal service. And I don't know how to find some of that stuff.
Probably not dissimilar. I mean, only a few years earlier, there were no stamps, and yet the recipient had to pay for everything. So
that's true.
That methodology may have been used, whatever it was. Yeah.
Well, they used to be able to the postmaster or the postal delivery guy would go up to the house and say, hey, got a letter for you. You owe us 8p. And if you didn't get the 8p, they didn't deliver the letter.
Yeah.
So what happened back then was that they would look at a letter, they could see the handwriting on it, and then sometimes they had different codes on the letter. And to say, all right, if you don't pay for it, I'm okay. And that there's a small code that they'll be able to do. So that's how it got delivered back in the really old days, like 1850s and prior. I don't know between those dates.
Thanks.
All right, thanks, Gary. There's one question from Ian Sadler. He says, what is the white book?
The white book.
You mentioned white. That's the instructional markings book, I think.
Do you mean 1988, the New South Wales?
Yes, the white book. Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So that's where you get most of the information on these things. And a lot of us, that white book has stood the test of time. They've done a pretty good job of it. There's some other books that haven't, but that one was very well researched. And the only thing is you find new things like, these covers, for example, and it's just time of when they turn up. And, if you publish any book, once it's out there, people say, oh, I've got this or I've got that. It always happens. But that's one of the books that stood the test of time.
Okay, any more questions for Gary? No? All right, thank you, Gary. I think that was great.
Stop sharing.
You can stop sharing. And
Yep.
Martin Walker, you're up next. Are you able to share your screen, Martin?
I shall see. There we go. Right, how does that look?
Just there he goes. There it is.
Okay. Slideshow. Mine's full screen, so I'm not sure how that appears on everyone else's.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to have a look at a couple of less investigated topics on the Ross Smith stamp from the 1919 flight from England to Australia. So, and both of these sort of came about as my involvement with the Aeropex 2019 centenary exhibition, and one's sort of new information and the other one's revisiting some old information with a little bit extra. So the first up, when we had James Grimwood Taylor came over to judge at Aeropex, and he slipped in his bag a photograph of this cover, which was then on display at the National Postal Museum in London. And that was part of their centenary celebrations for a lot of, the Alcock and Brown flight, the Smith Brothers flight, the Paris Airmail flights. There was about 6 anniversaries that all started in 1919. Now, what struck me about this was that first sentence in this letter written by Keith Smith, where he's writing to this Miss Taylor, you may be able to get one of the special stamps if they are issued. And this was written before they had left England. And of course, up to this point, and probably still is the case, that the general belief about the stamps was there was a total confusion between what Ross Smith had asked Billy Hughes to obtain for them. And of course, Billy Hughes thought he wanted a date stamp. And it wasn't until mid-January 1920 that he realised he actually wanted a stamp, and then hurriedly prepared a stamp for the mail that they had brought across. So this is clearly before they left England, and it's a good 6 weeks before that debate really started appearing in the Australian newspapers about whether it was a date stamp or a postage stamp that Ross Smith had requested. I have no record of Ross Smith making a request to Billy Hughes before they left England. So I find this letter quite remarkable as to why he's written that. Now, one of the thoughts that I did have, of course, was prior to the Vickers Vimy flight to Australia, Vickers Vimy provided an aeroplane to attempt the transatlantic flight by Alcock and Brown, and of course that was successful, and they did in fact carry an airmail from Newfoundland across to Ireland, where they crashed, and then brought it on to England, where it all ended up into the mail. And the stamp, of course, was quite rare, and the covers, well, I think it was 197 covers. I think they carried in what was an official mailbag. Now, I did know that John Alcock met Ross and Keith Smith before they left England, and I was just hurriedly doing some research for this talk, and realised then that John Alcock was actually the test pilot for the Vickers Vimy that flew to Australia, and he flew it on the 31st of October with Ross and Keith Smith as passengers to observe the flight. What's even more remarkable about this is that the next 8 days was snowed in. Ross and Keith Smith took the Vickers Vimy up for one more test flight, and 3 days later they left for Australia. So in a plane which had only done 2 test flights. I think it's sort of adds to the legend of their daring on attempting such a thing in a brand new aircraft with 2 test flights. The value of the Alcock and Brown covers was certainly known before they had left England. I'd been doing some research in some old stamp magazines that I have and found these records of sales of the Alcock and Brown flight covers and stamps prior to the Smith brothers leaving England. So we have a stamp here fetched £1.10, and then a cover fetched £2.15, and another stamp £1.04, and another cover £2.10. So these were all recorded sales before they left England. And it sort of gives me some belief that at some stage when Alcock and the Smith brothers were testing their Vickers Vimy and talking about the flight and the anticipation, that you sort of feel that a discussion about this mail and the stamps and their value, as was already apparent, is a high probability of it being discussed. And this may be the catalyst for the Smith brothers asking for a stamp for the mail that they were going to carry. All conjecture, of course, but we'll see where it goes. The other aspect that I wanted to look at was all the mint examples that were floating around. Nelson Eustace always said that all the mint copies early on were presentation copies. And I've searched and searched and searched as to who would have got a presentation copy and what's happened to those presentation copies. And I really can't find anything to say that this dignitary got a presentation copy of the stamp and it's turned up later in their archive or their personal papers or in an archive or in the market. There's just nothing at all. So I'm tending to doubt the suggestion that these things were presentation copies or the mint stamps. So in the Philatelic press, the first discussion about the mint stamp was by Fred Hagen, who actually requested to get a copy of a mint stamp so that he could make a block and illustrate it in the Federal Australian Philatelist, which he duly did. He was sent a stamp from the Prime Minister's Department with strict instructions to return it, which he duly did. And interestingly, when he returned it, he made a suggestion that they send a copy of the stamp to H.L. White to be added to the White collection. Now, I've not been able to determine at the moment if there is in fact a mint Ross Smith stamp in the White collection, and if so, where it came from. But that is the earliest indication of a mint stamp sort of outside of the hands of the Prime Minister's Department that I've been able to find. This particular letter has come from a National Archives file, which is held in Melbourne, and the reference I've just put down there, and it applies to all these other letters that I've reproduced from the National Archives. It's in a file covering airmail stamps from 1920 to 38. And it starts with a discussion on the Ross Smith stamp and finishes with a discussion on the Ross Smith stamp, but in between there are discussions on the 1929 stamp and the Kingsford Smith stamps from 1931. I did find in the National Archives catalogue, there was a suggestion sent to them that the leftover unused stamps should be sold to raise funds for the Australian War Memorial. It was only the suggestion, and the file that is in the National Archives, all I can see is the thumbnail description of what it contains. I think it's yet to be opened, so somebody may need to request that because it's not here in Adelaide anymore. And there's another file which indicates that a stamp was donated by Mr. Grantham to the Australian War Memorial. Now, that may be a stamp. It may have been a stamp on cover because Captain Grantham is listed as one of the recipients of a letter in Tom Frommer's book. And the War Memorial also has their own example on the letter, which is the one illustrated here, which was one actually sent to them by Ross Smith. So there may be a presentation copy in the War Memorial. The Royal Collection, when the centenary was up here, the State Library here in South Australia holds a lot of the Ross and Keith Smith papers, and they had them on display in 2019 and 2020. And two of the things they had on the display were these two letters from the Keeper of the Royal Collection at Buckingham Palace. One of them acknowledgement, an offer of a stamp from the Smith brothers, and the other one is an indication or thanking them for the receipt of that particular stamp. Now, when I look up the Royal Collection book, there are two examples of the stamp in the Royal Collection. One of them is the cover here, and also addressed to Trevor Dawson, who was the General Manager of Vickers. And the other one is one from Ross and Keith Smith. It's mentioned in the Royal Collection catalogue, and it's a used example on peace. Now, I would find it astonishing that if you're going to give something as a presentation to the King, that you'd give him a cutout from a cover rather than a nice mint copy, but the King never got one. So once again, it sort of knocks on the head the idea that these were presentation copies were available for dignitaries. I was having a look at the items that were in the market early on in the piece, and I thank Jeff Kello for sharing his census of famous Australian philatelic items for this, and going through that census and going through magazines and catalogues from my own library. These are the examples that I found in the market prior to 1938, and there's really not too many. So the earliest stamp I found a record of a sale of is in 1926, which I realised £50. In the 20s and 30s, H.R. Harmer in London used to have an annual airmail stamps catalogue or auction, and most of these are from those auctions. So in 1928, there was another stamp offered. 1929, one stamp and a cover. The 1929 one fetched £96, and that actually made the newspapers here in Australia, that particular piece of news. 1930, another stamp. Sorry, that should be 1931, another stamp. 1932, 3 stamps and 2 covers hit the market, and another later in 1932, another stamp. So we can see there they were starting to dribble out, I could say, is probably the best description of the release or appearance of these stamps. Just 1 or 2 a year for a good 10 years. In 1938, however, David Field in London, who dealt in rare stamps, but they also specialised in air post material, and they actually published a catalogue of air post stamps in 1929-30, announced to the world that they had just purchased 22 mint examples of this particular stamp, which was completely astonishing. And they were offering them at £65, at £65 sterling. In Australian pounds, I think it was about £80. And first come, first serve, limit of 2 per person. And it's quite remarkable. They advertised it extensively in the British press, but did not advertise it at all in the Australian press. When the news hit Australia, the Australian Stamp Monthly had a couple of comments to make. The editorial had a nice kind comment to congratulate Fields on this particular purchase. But Nelson Eustace, who wrote an Aero Philately column under the pen name Paravion, he had a little bit more to say about it. And he then sort of said that a recent purchase of 22 stamps for an item which was, previously a very rare item, fetching £100 or more, that some inquiries should be made with the Prime Minister's Department and the postal authorities to work out where these things had come from, and perhaps also to ensure that no more were going to come out, because it would have certainly destroyed the market. That behind the scenes led to some investigations by the Post Office Department, and the Post Office Department's main concern was not the fact that these stamps had came out, but because Nelson Eustace had written in his column a sort of a bit of a slur on the Post Office and their security, and they wanted to rebuff it. So they sent their own little investigation into play, and soon learned that, of course, the stamps weren't produced by the Post Office. They were produced by the Treasury for the Prime Minister's Department, and pretty quickly washed their hands of it. And even though there was some push from within the Post Office to get a retraction printed in the Stamp Monthly, in the end they decided not to pursue it, and the retraction was never published. So we have a copy there from the Chief Inspector, the Post Office, reporting on the piece from the Stamp Monthly, and a letter there from John Ash in response back to the Post Office, just basically tell them that the stamps were not done for them, they were done for the Prime Minister. That wasn't the end of it, though. They continued to pursue, a possible leak, and of course, a leak in the Prime Minister's Department is going to be even more serious than from the Post Office. And they found records to say that the Prime Minister's Department had 450 stamps delivered to them, and of course 364 of those were used on their mail, which then leaves us 86 mint stamps, which is interesting because most records say 87, so there's a discrepancy of one stamp coming up here. And they are then urging the Prime Minister's Department to look at how those 450 stamps were disposed of. A remarkable thing then happened is that the investigators in the particular matter drew upon a very, very obscure regulation in the Post and Telegraph Act, and they, of course, knew that David Fields were the buyers of the stamps, and they knew what their telegraphic address was because it was in all their advertisements. So they actually instructed the staff of the Post Office to go through copies of the cablegrams that were sent in late 1937 and 1938 to find out who was communicating with David Field in London. And there's a very, very familiar name to us all there. It was Mr. Purvis, was acting on behalf of the sellers, and he was the person negotiating this deal with Fields. The inspectors sent some people around to talk to Mr. Purvis, and he just said, client confidentiality, I ain't telling you, and clammed up, and that seemed to be the end of the matter. Later on in the year, in the September issue of the Stamp Monthly, Fields were also aware of what Nelson had wrote, and they wanted to defend their position about their purchase. And so they wrote this letter to the editor, which was published in the September ASM. And almost to rub salt in the wound, they also took out that full-page ad in the ASM to say that there's only 6 of them left. So I thought it was a little bit of cunning, but clearly there was a good demand for them even at that price. They sold 16 of them in 6 months or so. Of course, in 1938, Purvis wasn't budging, so nothing then happened until 10 years later. Now, the file that I saw in Melbourne finished in 1938, but clearly Nelson had seen another file, which I think is probably the other end of the correspondence from the Treasury, and maybe one of those files that got destroyed by the Treasury in Canberra sometime in the 1980s, because the story is taken up to 1948, where there was clearly a review of the case. And once again, the auditors went to speak to Mr. Purvis. He still refused to tell them who he was acting on their behalf, except to say that he had since died. And so the Treasury sort of felt that they couldn't pursue it any further. And their reaction to the whole case was that in 1948, they ordered the note printing branch to destroy the printing blocks, which they duly did. So, of course, who was the particular civil servant? Now, Nelson described it in the file. It was a civil servant who was active at the time of the air race and was involved with the civil service in 1920. Now, probably the number one suspect is this gentleman, Percy Dean, who was Billy Hughes's private secretary, and he would have handled a lot of the affairs to do with the air race, and particularly after they had arrived in Australia. And he, together with another gentleman called Shepherd. Shepherd was a person to whom the mailbag was delivered in Melbourne, and who organised to have all of the stamps affixed to the envelopes and send them on. So Percy Dean was the Prime Minister's secretary. He later then became secretary to the Prime Minister's department about a year later, and was still in that position when Canberra moved from Melbourne to Canberra in August 1927. But he did fall out of favour when Hughes was defeated by Bruce in an election, and sort of found himself on the outer because clearly Bruce was from another political department and didn't really trust Dean, and sort of pushed him to the outer, and then pushed him even further to the outer in 1929 when he ended up in the Department of Home Affairs. Dean did become sort of quite an ill man, but it was probably an ill man because of the way he was treated in Canberra, and his health began to decline after he was pushed to the outer, and then he finally retired in 1936 and returned to Melbourne, considerably less wealthy than what he was in Canberra, because he was on something like £1,250 a year as a salary when he was in the Prime Minister's department, and that dropped when he went to the Home Affairs, and just dropped and dropped and dropped as he got pushed from down the ranks and further to the outer. And there is a newspaper story about his decline where he had a big house in Canberra with servants and gardeners, and by the early 1930s there's a story to say that all of his gardeners had gone and all of his servants had gone, and he was not having a very good time of it at all. So he took an early retirement in 1936 and moved back to Melbourne, and then died of cancer in 1946, which tees in with Purvis's assertion that the person concerned had died before 1948. This was the cover that was offered in Lesky's special Aeropex sale. It's been around for quite a while, this cover, but it's been misdescribed the last 3 occasions it's been offered, because everyone's assumed that the dear captain referred to Captain Ross Smith. But of course, being a letterhead from the Prime Minister's department in Canberra, it can't be before 1927. And of course, Ross Smith was killed in 1922. And I pointed this out to Charles, and he sort of thought, he had one of those duh moments, and he said, that's obvious, why didn't we pick that up? So I went off to try and find out who the captain was, and I was busily working away there and realising that if Dean had not gone to Canberra until late 27 and he was out of the department by 29, he's got to be 1928. So I looked at the Canberra newspapers around May 1928, and lo and behold, we find 5 days before this letter was written, Dean and Billy Hughes were having dinner with Bert Hinkler. So I was fairly then certain then that the recipient of this letter was Bert Hinkler, who of course was still on his celebratory tour around Australia after his solo flight from England in 1927. I've since had that confirmed, because I found the original offering of this cover, which was by Harmers in 1973, where the provenance was given to Hinkler. So it's a really nice thing to tie together, the two of the earliest flights from England to Australia with the first flight and the first solo flight. There are a few other items which link Dean with the philatelic trade. Of course, he was the recipient of 2 of the letters on the email, one addressed to him as the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department, and the other one addressed to him as P.E. Dean himself. And I noticed then that on the postcard that was produced in 1929 for the 10th anniversary of the flight, and these postcards were produced by David Fields, the cover illustrated is one of these. It's the cover addressed to the Secretary of the Prime Minister's Department. And so it would have come from Dean. So in summary, with the mint copies, and Tom Frommer's book, he's listed all of these mint stamps. So 36 with selvage and 16 without selvage. And if we compare that to what was offered before, there was 14 examples that I found records offered prior to the 22 examples in 1938. So that's 36. Tom's identified 52 of them, so there's a possible 86 and an 87th one, which the arithmetic doesn't quite add up, because Note Printing Branch say they printed 576 and destroyed 125. 450 went to the Prime Minister's Department. They had 86 left over, so there's one odd one, and I can't really account for the odd one except to say that in the National Archives catalogue, there's one stamp that seems to be held in a New South Wales police file, and it's another file that's yet to be examined. It's sitting over there in Sydney, I think. So if someone in Sydney wants to take up the cause and go and have a look at the file, they might find a new example of a mint stamp. So that's that new bit of information I can share with the Ross Smith stamp.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. I reckon that was fantastic. I'm kind of dumbfounded. I didn't know most of that information until now. Any questions for Martin?
Not a question for Martin. It's just a statement to say, outside of Victoria Cross winners, Ross Smith was the most decorated Australian serviceman in World War I. Military Cross and Bar, Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 bars, Air Ace, and he got all his flying experience during the Light Horse campaign from Egypt to Syria. That's where all this experience came from. But he's the most decorated Australian serviceman of all time.
Yes, and if you get to read his own account of the flight, and there was one that was republished in 2019. There was a book called Anzac and Aviator, published in 2019. That's thoroughly recommended. It is. And of course, the other thing a lot of people don't know is that he was Lawrence of Arabia's pilot.
Yes.
That campaign. So yes, he was certainly much admired and much decorated here.
Definitely. Any other questions for Martin?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Martin,
yes.
Jack here. I've got both Nelson Eustace's book and also Tom Frommer's book, where I've read a little bit about this stamp, but I don't fully understand why Gibbons doesn't list it, or am I missing a point?
Gibbons don't list it because it was not issued by the post office.
Right.
The other point of the stamp, it didn't prepay postage. It was a label added to a mail on delivery rather than prior to posting like the Alcock and Brown stamps from Newfoundland were.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
I've got a question. Really?
Yep.
Related to the stamp, when I was in Adelaide at the end of 2019, you, Martin, said that with all the publicity surrounding the 100th anniversary, that some unknown Ross Smith covers have sort of turned up in various households in Adelaide. Was any sort of record made of these?
Most of the ones that did turn up had been recorded before. They were actually in Tom's book, except for one example which had not been illustrated before, and that ended up being donated to the State Library to go with the Ross Smith collection.
Any other questions? Do you want to stop sharing, Martin? And I'll get
There you go.
Malcolm. Start there. Presentation.
Right. Well, while that's just coming up, I'm showing to you, here we are, the coronation cards of George V's. What I'm showing today is a selection of coronation cards issued by the Australian Post Office in 1911 to commemorate the coronation of George V. And I've decided to show this as it's only a matter of weeks away before we have the coronation of King Charles III in England. So what I've done is I've put together a representative range of cards to show both mint and usage of these cards during that period. Next, please.
Sorry about that.
The cards here show the three different cards that were issued. One of George V, one of Queen Mary, his wife, and their son, who was the Prince of Wales. Both the King and the Prince of Wales were photographs taken when these two visited Australia in 1907 as part of a naval flotilla that went to look at the areas around the Pacific. But the Queen Mary was never photographed, and so they managed to find in a government office or on the estate a painting that had been done of the Queen some time earlier, and although it was not signed, it was of a suitable standard to be a good recognition of the Queen Mary. So there we go. Next, please. And here we've got these same three in rectangular frames, but you can see both the George V and the Prince of Wales have both got in the corner of each photograph the name of the photographer who took the photographs. Next, please. The government printer managed to acquire some special frames that came from England, which highlight the occasion more. And here we have the first one with the two different crowns, the crown for the King and the crown for the Queen, and the lion and the unicorn, which is a symbol of the British government around, and it also it starts to indicate the different colours that were used on these cards. Next, please. And we have on this one the monograms of both the King and the Queen, with the same lion and unicorn surround as well. Next, please. Another similar sort of frame with crowns on, but at the bottom of the one of King George V, there's a small section missing of the frame, which has broken off on that particular printing. Next, please. And we have two cards of the Prince of Wales. We show one showing his naval interest with the thing at the top, and the other one is his official crest. Next, please. Next, please. No, yeah. And the last one of the different cards and the frames is this laurel leaf surround with ribbon at the top. On the right hand side, the ribbon doesn't enter the picture of the King, but on the lower one of the Queen Mary, that's the other variety with the ribbon coming within the frame of the Queen. Next, please. And we've now left the mint cards and the various frames. We're now going to be looking at the different usage for these cards. The first one we show is a card to Switzerland from Australia from Adelaide in 1913. with a tax mark from Australia because it didn't have the additional halfpenny foreign rate stamp on it. And on arrival in Switzerland, it has had attached a to pay label from the Swiss post office. Next, please. This card is going to Prague, which was then in part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it does show an additional adhesive for Western Australia and for halfpenny. Next, please.
Roger, you
Frank.
muted, that's it.
Sorry, what have I done?
You're right now.
Okay. Right. Two tax marks, and then the portage, which is the payment of the bill for the fine. Next, please. Next. Another card going to Germany, to Hanover, and this card has a tax mark and a more interesting cover stamp for the Porto, for payment of the fine from Hanover, and it's just an interesting cover from that point of view. Next, please. An internal use card, but as you can see from the red circle, the top of the crown has broken off on the printing, and that's one of the few varieties that you get with the coronation cards. Next. A card going to Germany and sent from Ipswich in Queensland, and so has a halfpenny Queensland adhesive. Next, please. Another internally used card, used with Victoria travelling post office mark on it. Next, please. A card going to Sweden with a South Australia adhesive of a halfpenny. Nothing more in 1911. Next, please. A card going to the Dutch East Indies, to Java, in fact, and has a penny Victoria stamp on it, which is overpaid by a halfpenny in 1912. What we should say about all these cards is that the first printings were thick white card with white on the reverse, or buff on the reverse. These cards, and the cards, and the same card was used for the letter cards issued in late 1912 with the same card, thick card used. Next, please. Bosnia. This card going to Bosnia with a New South Wales adhesive of a halfpenny. Bosnia was part of the Ottoman Empire at that time, and an unusual destination. The coronation cards also came later on in different thicknesses of card as well. So there's the two main thicknesses with the buff and the white, and some others that I've found that are different printings, printed cards. Next, please. Fascinating card, this one. It was originally sent to Natal, to a ship's captain on the 7th of February 1916. It arrived in Natal, and then was redirected from the 1st of March when it arrived to Baltimore, to the ship's captain, who was Swedish. Having got to Baltimore, they still couldn't find the ship's captain, and the card was duly sent back to Bombay, where it disappeared into the ether because it was undelivered. And quite an interesting travelled card there. Next, please. Card to Rome, Italy. Firstly, it's interesting to note that it has a Western Australia adhesive of a halfpenny on it, but both the card and the adhesive have been cancelled in New South Wales. And the other interesting remark to make is the larger cachet is a military one, checking the mail coming into the country, because by 1914 Italy was already at war on the Allies' side on this occasion with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire as well. Next, please. And this card is going to Denmark, to Copenhagen, and it has a similar sort of marks that have previously been shown by Gary Diffen. Well, it has the penny to pay mark has been applied first, but some of the print has not come out, so it's been written in. And the rectangular one is a deficiency of 5 centimes because it didn't have the halfpenny adhesive. So that, and then the next line says fine 5 centimes. So the total for the fine is 10 French centimes. Next, please. This card with Prince of Wales on it is addressed to Kobe in Japan, and has writing in Japanese down the side, which I haven't had translated, but I'm sure it relates to the address, with an additional penny halfpenny profile George V halfpenny stamp recently produced, and the Japanese cachet in the center is applied to all foreign mail coming into the country, and that was dated 1916, received in Japan. Next, please. A card addressed to a passenger on the P&O ship Malwa, heading for for probably Europe, well, probably England, and it's addressed to Portside and the P&O office. And the thing you have to remember about Portside and Egypt is that it was part of the Ottoman Empire, but was sort of taken over by the British in 1882 to protect their use of the Suez Canal, and stayed like that until the 1950s, when Egypt took back the use of the canal, etc. Next, please. Card addressed to Wisconsin in the USA, with an additional halfpenny, one of these small Bantam Victoria stamps on it, dated 1913. I've tried to show in this display so far 5 different states additional adhesives on my covers, which is unusual to get so many together, because they were used up until the introduction of the George V profile head stamps. Next, please. A card. This is an interesting card. Going to Antigua in the Caribbean, and it's gone via USA, across America by train, and then down to sort of place somewhere like Miami, and then put on a boat and taken to Antigua. It was dated October 1911, and it has a receiving mark, as you can see, for December the 21st, 1911. Next, please. Somebody else in this in these displayed showed a cover going to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and a very unusual destination, with that rectangular cachet saying deficient by 10 centimes, and the fine was 10 centimes, and so the total fine was 20 centimes of for the equivalent in Argentinian pesos, and it's different because the rate to Argentina, South America, it was that much more, and so this has been adjusted. Unlike the other one that just said it was 5 centimes, then that was just going to Europe. And on the reverse of this cover is part of the arrival mark, but so you can see that it arrived in Argentina. Thank you. Next, please. A used internally card, but printed up at the back for the Commonwealth Club of Adelaide, and they are inviting Lieutenant General Sir Richard Baden-Powell to talk to the group on his life and the founding of the Scout movement in 1907. And this group met reasonably regularly, sort of every other month, and they always had a guest speaker, and this is one of the more notable ones. Next, please. Another card similarly printed up at the reverse, but this is a travelling representative for Burlington House Limited, a company that deals with clothing for men and women. And as you can see, it's been neatly written at an angle along the top of the different categories of, and and the representative is indicating that he will be calling on that particular date. Next, please. And then we have coronation cards. So it's coronation cards that were overprinted OHMS so that they could be used as acknowledgement cards for the for use by government bodies. Next, please. And we have another two, one showing Queen Mother, the Queen, and the other one showing the Prince of Wales. Next, please. And this last one is to the head person of the railways, the chief engineer of the railways in 1913. After the cards these coronation cards the other cards had been withdrawn from usage. The main idea of these coronation cards was to help to show the population, which was now 4.5 million. Many of them hadn't any idea of the royal family, but show them what it was all about, and that there was a king and queen back in England, because a lot of people had come to Australia during the gold rush period in 1850s and onwards, and the population had gone from 450,000 to just over 4,400,000 in those 60 years. Next, please. And we talked to, and this company, Bremer and Co, are the only company that I've been able to find that have had these coronation cards printed up specially for use in this way and advertised the company. And in the middle there is, on the reverse, is an order form for the recipients to write their orders and send them in. And this company had offices both in Melbourne and Adelaide. Next, please. And here we have the Adelaide one. What's happened is the person sending in the order has readdressed it not to Melbourne but to the Adelaide office, and there you've got the order from the company concerned. Very difficult to find and research, but this is the only company that had these cards overprinted in this way for their use. Next, please. And the last card I'm showing is a card dated the 22nd of June 1911, which was the date of the coronation. And on the reverse, the lady writing it is sending her prayers to everybody, hoping that the reign of King George V will be a great success. And thank you very much indeed. That's the end of my display.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger.
Thank you.
I like that last card. I think that was a good one. Being posted on the day of the coronation. It's great. Now, any questions for Roger? There's silence out there.
Oh dear.
Is that
Not
good or
good.
bad, right? questions? Any comments or questions from for any of the other presenters that we had while we?
Just with Roger, did you say, Roger, that they didn't have a photograph of Queen Mary?
That is correct.
Because probably the most famous stamps of her are the Rhodesian double heads. And according to the book on Rhodesian stamps, the image is based on the photographs by Downey, and it includes signed copies of her photo signed by her. So the Rhodesian double stamps that have got Mary and George together appear to be based exclusively on these Downey photographs. So I'm surprised that they wouldn't have had them for the...
What year are we talking about?
In 1910.
1910, I see. Yeah. Well, that's what the Australian government decided. They hadn't got a photograph. So therefore, and along with the printer, the government printer, they
maybe they didn't have one in
came
Australia.
up with they came up with this bloke.
Yeah, maybe they didn't have it in Australia.
Communication at that time wasn't as wonderful as it is now. You can find out moments later what's happened, you know, wherever. But you can't do that. You couldn't do that in Australia. And remember the population was 4.5 million, of which 4 million were probably mainly from Europe. Because of all the wars and the other trials and tribulations of that part of the world. In fact, Germany didn't become the state of Germany until 1872, and so it was. You had Prussia and all those other small states fighting each other, along with the Austro-Hungarian War, and that was the whole reason the Australians produced these cards, to try and bring these people into an Australian view of a crown and monarchy. But obviously it failed, because the amount of cards that actually sold was incredibly small, and a large number of them were actually destroyed. So effectively, something like 700,000 cards were actually sold and issued, and they were only on sale for 2 years.
Frank, can I share a picture?
Yeah, sure. No worries. You?
Hello? Oh, thank you very much indeed.
There's the double head, and there's Queen Mary. She's wearing exactly the same thing as what's shown in the coronation cards, and King George V is wearing exactly the same as the coronation cards.
Yeah.
And this just for information for people, this is the Northern Rhodesia strike on a 4-penny double head. These are the rarest postmarks on the 4-penny, because you don't find them. So anytime you get a Northern Rhodesia postmark on a 4-penny, that's what you have to look out for. But that it's the same portrait, it's the same picture, because you can see she's wearing everything around her neck.
It's the same exactly, but it's the painted version of that, isn't it?
It is. That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. Because she's more to one side, isn't she?
I think the other side.
Waterloo did the printing for the double head, and the actual double head was actually going to be used for the visit. But then obviously King Edward VII died very suddenly, and so that's why it changed and became the double head issue.
Oh, right. Well, that was interesting.
Roger, I think the original double head was going to be Edward VII and his wife Alexandria.
Correct.
And
on the visit,
at the last minute.
Yeah, on the visit to overseas, but then it got cancelled.
Roger, just make a comment on one cover that you had was posted in Adelaide to a Mr. Kohler, I think his name was, City. Flinders Street City. It didn't say Melbourne. Is there a Flinders Street in Adelaide?
Which card was that? Was that the first one?
I was halfway through it, and it was from South Australia.
South Australia.
And
Yes, there is a Flinders Street in Adelaide. Yes.
There is. Okay.
Yeah, well, there you go.
Thank you very much indeed for helping me out on that one. Thank you.
Mark Zero wrote in the chat, he says the photos used were commercially acquired blocks from the UK. Perhaps they hadn't acquired permission to use the Queen's picture commercially.
Ah, interesting thought.
Yeah, very interesting thought.
Yes. So, well, I'll somewhere else to look, go for the evidence on that.
That's right.
But I would have thought that because of the occasion, it would have been automatically granted.
Not necessarily.
Not
No,
necessarily.
definitely not.
Okay.
It may well have been a privately photograph, or
That's right.
they meant.
Right. Okay, thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments?
With those views on the cards, you can get private picture postcards with those same pictures on them to reinforce what Mark has said, that they are blocks bought from a commercial block maker.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay.
Well, at this point, I'd like to thank all five presenters. I'd point out that when I approached them and volunteered, when they were given the opportunity to present, they immediately grasped it with alacrity. Thank you, all of you. And the level of research that's gone into these presentations is amazing. I've learned a huge amount. One could almost say that you're all forensic philatelists. The new information is tremendous. I've learned a lot, so thank you very much.
No, I agree, Brian. I think I learned very a lot in regards to today's presentations. They're all very well researched. They're all very well presented. So I congratulate you all on some very good presentations. Even though I did go for 2 hours, I didn't think it's going to go for that long. But I think the 2 hours went pretty quickly. So anyway, on behalf of the Royal Philatelic Society of Victoria and the BSAP, I'd like to thank presenters, and I would could everybody just make their thanks thankful by giving a round of applause. All right, what I'll do, I'll stop recording, and then I'll do